Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords. This is the Rental Income Podcast. And now, Dan Lane.
Mike, you bought a rental property that didn't work out that great. What happened?
We just kept running into problem after problem after problem. Maintenance was higher than we thought it would be. Occupancy was constantly turning over every single month. The inability to push rents higher like we thought would. We literally got pinched from every single angle, and it made the property quite challenging to cash flow and make into a good investment.
This property looked incredible on Mike's spreadsheet. He should have made a lot of money with it, but in reality, the property never made money. So on the show today, we're going to figure out what went wrong, see if there's anything that Mike could have done differently to turn things around, and we'll see how he ultimately got rid of the property. Joining us on the show today from Atlanta is Mike O'Connor. We'll take a quick break to thank our sponsors. We'll come right back and we'll talk to Mike. It's a lot of work to find a really good rental property. And when you actually find that property, you want to make sure you're working with a lender that can get that loan closed. The lender that I recommend is Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group. She's a nationwide lender and her specialty is helping investors finance rental properties. She has a ton of loan programs and she can find something customized to you for your situation. If you want to find out more or you're ready to get started today, just go to ridgelendinggroup.com. That's RIDGE lendinggroup.com. NMLS 42056.
Rental Income Podcast.
Mike, let's try to figure out what went wrong with this property. So was this your very first rental or did you own other properties?
No, not our very first rental. My partners and I owned other properties. This was the largest property we purchased, though. So this property was 100 units. And prior to that, the largest that we've acquired was a 32 unit. So
Okay.
There were new dynamics that come into play when you're in a 100 unit space than some of those smaller mid-sized multis that we have experience in owning and managing.
So just like looking back on it and just kind of hypothetical, do you think that was maybe part of what went wrong, that you had just bought too big of a building?
I think so. I mean, there's a couple of factors at play, Dan. So, first and foremost, those of you that are listening probably know this. The way that, let's say, a 32-unit complex operates and is managed is very different than 100 units. When you get to a 100-unit status, right, you've got full on-site management. You've got full-time maintenance, and like the culture of the community really matters, right? You get a couple bad eggs in that property, the culture starts to become a bad egg culture. It becomes much harder to manage. And then we were 3.5 hours away from this asset as opposed to it being kind of 30 minutes from our house. And so we were less hands-on with it. And that made it very challenging.
That makes sense. All right, so let's talk about this property a little bit. So how did you find it?
Yeah, this was an off-market property that we were providing. So someone that I trust, and I still trust, and he's a great investor and mentor, and he actually partnered with us on this deal. Knew a couple of gentlemen who had a property that was for sale. It was down in a place called Albany, Georgia. So it's South Georgia. It's a declining market. There's not a lot of industry there. And it came to us on some back channels. These guys had a 95 vintage. It was 100 units, like I mentioned before. And they left enough meat on the bone as far as they went in. They did some value add. They did some things that were fixed up. They replaced the roofs. They got it in good condition, but left a little bit for us to do. They left some down units. They left some what we perceived as potential value add that we could squeeze into it. So it wasn't actively marketed. It was kind of ours for the taking, and it looked like a great deal on paper.
So what was the price? What did you end up buying the building for?
We bought it for $2.8 million. So, again, as you can imagine, that's $28,000 a door. Yeah. It just looked very appealing.
And what was the average rent for the units?
The average rents came out to about $600. So
Wow.
You'd have some that were lower, maybe $450. You had some that were higher, $650. The $650s outweighed the $450s, right, to get to that average. There was a mixture of 3 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms, and then varying degrees of rent readiness. Was it carpet? Was it LVP? What kind of, stainless steel versus black and white appliances? some of the typical things that you'd see in a complex like this.
So, I mean, on the surface, I mean, this sounds like a pretty good deal. The numbers
Oh
are
yeah.
great. I mean, you're buying it, for a really good price. So, what was the property kind of mismanaged?
It's hard to say. It was challenging again because we were so far away. We would talk to the on-site property manager, and we would hear one story. And this is before we stepped in and started doing our own management. We never actually took this management project on, even though we had a management company, because it was 3.5 hours away. Mm-hmm. But I owned a management company, so I knew the questions to be asking. And we never could quite piece together what on-site was telling us and what the management company was telling us. Things weren't adding up. There were back due water bills, electricity bills weren't getting paid, turnover was high. So yeah, I would say there was a lot of mismanagement that went on, and it was really hard to pin it down because again, it was 3 hours away,
Right.
3.5 hours away.
Right.
You couldn't just pop over there and solve problems yourself.
All right, let's take a look at the financing and figure out how you paid for this. So how did you finance the property?
So we got a bank loan for 80% of the down payment. We then did a seller holdback, seller financing of 10%. And then we brought in debt partners at another 10%. So that, as you can imagine, the cash flow every month is going to be very important because we got a lot of debt obligation that we have to be paying.
Right. Okay. So every month you've got the payment to the bank, you've got the payment to the seller, and then a payment to your investors.
We structured the investor and the seller financing to be paid on a quarterly basis, which helps.
Okay.
So that helps kind of build up some cash flow. And there would be some cash flow positive months here and there. But by and large, it was running somewhat neutral. So as those quarterly payments would come up, things had to get creative.
So how much total rent do you think you were, if everything was operating perfectly and you had good occupancy and not many repairs coming up, how much rent were you thinking you were going to bring in every month?
Well, if you assume a little bit of vacancy, right? And,
Yeah.
and you always want a little bit of vacancy because it means you're pushing the rents the highest. But if things were 100% occupied, the total rent would come in around $60,000.
Okay.
And again, this is many years removed, this the specific project, but I recall having months that would hit 38,000, 45,000, right? Like, stressfully low numbers of collectibles that made it very challenging.
Wow. So when you're collecting 38,000, like, was that even covering your debt payments?
That was right around like the operating cost of the property, right? Including the debt service. And I want to say the debt service every month I recall was 14,000 to 16,000 just with the bank financing piece. And then just the general ongoing OPEX that you have on the property. And then of course the quarterly payments.
Wow. So was that vacancy, like with the getting half of what you should have been getting, was that because the units weren't full or people weren't paying?
It was a combination of both. So from a physical occupancy perspective, we tended to bounce around in that kind of like 85 to 92 range, right? Mm-hmm. And most of it was probably in that mid 80s. Then if you want to talk economic occupancy, we tended to have, 5 or 6 evictions going on at any one time. The tenant pool that we kept pulling from just was not quality. And so when you then back that into like a high 70s, like economic occupancy, and even some of those people that were kind of paying in installments, it was slow going, it makes it very challenging.
So you mentioned a few minutes ago that the neighborhood wasn't that great or the area wasn't that great.
Yeah, and I don't want to necessarily say that it's not a great neighborhood because there's a lot of good folks from Albany and there's a lot of good things, but it's just a declining market, right?
Okay.
There's not much industry. I want to say there's a Coors Miller plant that was there, and that was about it. So as far as new jobs coming in, new people moving in, that wasn't happening. There was a net outflow population.
So do you think that was maybe part of the problem, that like you just can't fix something like that?
I think that was single-handedly the greatest problem, right? Because if we had it was a good product. The property itself, again, 1995 garden-style apartments. It had new roofs. It was a good community, right? If you had taken that and dropped it in the middle of Atlanta, you wouldn't have any of these problems, I don't think. So what was challenging was just the turnover was probably the biggest issue. And then the lack of people to go and fill it. So we were having to make concessions, or we weren't able to push the rents like we thought that we'd be able to push them. It just made it very slow going to get the property in a spot that, we found sustainable.
How about like did you look into maybe trying to get Section 8 tenants or people that were on some kind of assistance program?
We had Section 8 tenants as well. Yeah. So we were creative and opened all of those avenues. But again, it's just not the demand. So you go to Atlanta, like there's a waiting list for Section 8, right? You could have someone in your units very quickly. There, that just wasn't the case.
Wow. So really, like, unless you were going into it thinking that, all right, if we make $30,000 a month, we're good. Like that's probably the only way this really could have worked. It sounds like no matter how much you fixed it up or whatever you did to the property, you were never going to get to that $60,000 a month mark.
Yeah, and there were times where we'd have these really good months, right? These very high collectible months. And it kept kind of tricking us into diving back in. Oh, we're on the 1 yard line. We're almost there. We're turning it around, right? These like little silver linings we're seeing. And so we'd hop on a call with management one month and go, oh, great, guys, we're at 95% occupancy. And, to my earlier point, we know that's kind of the outlier. And then we hop on the phone call the next month. Oh, we're at 85%. It's like, well, it's easy to do the math when there's 100 units. Where did 10 people go? Right? That's just not normal turnover. Mm-hmm. And then, as you know, what does it mean? That means we're coming in, we're replacing carpet, replacing appliances, because oftentimes these people aren't exactly leaving the place, lickety split clean. So that added just a ton of, turnover cost. It was a cash flow killer.
Yeah. So were you having to put money in to pay for turning the units over or to make some of the payments?
Yeah, the money that we had to put in was more so on the payments. So again, like there was enough of a buffer and we were making enough cash flow every month where we were covering a lot of these turnovers. And I do recall there'd be a month where a couple of units would sit because we had such a backlog. So it's like, well, let's just fill up the units that are ready. And then as units pop up, we will turn them. It did help that we had an on-site maintenance guy. And so if it was a really light turn, he was already on the payroll anyway. He would go over there and he would do the turn and the punch. That saved us. If we were having to use straight 1099 contractor labor, that would have been a killer. Like for Atlanta rates, that would have really hurt us. And so that was the saving grace there. But when we had to make the quarterly debt payments, that's when we would pull cash flow from other properties. So not only was this just a drag, but it was a drag on some of our performing properties as well.
And you must have just felt like, okay, well, we just got to get through this tough period and then things are going to get better.
Correct. Like I said, we'd have a good month. We've kind of, we finally figured it out, right? And then the manager would quit. We'd hire a new manager. She looks great. And, 3 months later, she's gone, right? Personnel changes. I think the only consistent thing was actually our maintenance manager. He was there for many years, continued to be there. He was okay. But he was an HVAC technician, which was really good because, those of you that own multi-unit properties, you probably spent a fortune on your HVAC. That was, there were some little things there that really helped kind of save us from, worse situations.
Do you think that this is why the person that you bought it from sold the property, that they were dealing with the same thing and just got frustrated one day?
Yeah, that's a thought that's popped into my mind. You can't help but think that, right?
Yeah.
And they were, I guess we consider ourselves mom and pop investors. They were mom and pop investors as well. And I feel like maybe the only way, if there was a way to do it, would be more of a sophisticated, larger scale organization.
Yeah. Now, what about, with doing 100% financing on the property, what if you had put more money in so your debt payments were lower? Would that have made a difference?
Yeah, of course, right? So, the debt obligation every month would have been lower. Those quarterly payments wouldn't have come up and kind of been the drag on the other properties. So it would have made a difference. Now, would it have been worth our time, effort, risk, attention? I still would say no. It was not worth any of that. We could have reallocated those creative financing techniques towards an asset in, again, Atlanta or somewhere else that we were more familiar with and had a much better outcome.
Yeah, and I mean, that's also a lot of money to put in. I mean, to come up with 20% of $2.8 million, I mean, that's not always, very realistic. Yep. So when did it cross your mind, like, okay, we got to get out of this, like this is not working out?
Well, it crossed our mind a lot of times throughout the process, but a couple years in, we finally started looking at each other and saying, "All right, guys, like we love." We, we were growth minded, right? So,
Hmm.
we were at that point, we're at 180 units. This was 100 of them. We were acquiring more. We were flipping houses. Our portfolio was building, our presence was building. And I think mentally, if I'm being honest, it hurt us more to say, oh yeah, we're dropping 100 units from our portfolio. Right. And then we kind of realized that it doesn't matter whether it's 100 units or 10,000 units. If it's not cash flowing, there's no sense in having it.
Sure.
So a couple years in, we started putting the game plan together to get it ready and sold, and we enlisted. I think it was Cushman and Wakefield that we enlisted to sell it, and they did a great job.
How long did it take for them to sell it?
It took about 6 months,
Okay.
looking back.
And how long total did you own the property for?
I want to say we owned it for just over 3 years.
Okay.
From 2015 to 2018.
Well, all right. So, I mean, you gave it a good shot. I mean, that's long enough to realize
Correct.
this is not going to get better, and there's really not much more that you could have done differently. I mean, it sounds like you were doing all the right things.
We were turning over every rock, Dan. I mean, I found out there was a couple of missed water bills, like I mentioned earlier, and I did an entire audit of the entire prior year's water bills from every single unit, and the management company that we had in place was missing like quite literally $20,000 in payments. So like there were issues like that were popping up as well, that just made it challenging. But yeah, we tried. We rolled our sleeves up and we got after it.
So now with selling the building, were you able to make any money on the sale, or did you lose money there too?
Yeah, we sold it for right at around 3.4. So, and then we backed out the broker fees. And so the ending of the story is, it was like a comically low amount with all the investors in there. I think every person made like 60 grand or 55 grand, right?
Yeah.
Throughout the entire process. And if you net out some of the rental, cash flow that we lost, honestly, the entire project probably got us somewhere in the ballpark of break even. But to get the, small pop at the end was a relief.
Well, I think that's also a big lesson. I mean, that you bought the property right. I mean, if you had overpaid for that property, you would have been in trouble.
If we had overpaid, if it was a different market, different time, right? Keep in mind during that time, things were just kind of going up. And so we weren't able to force any additional appreciation to it, right? I wasn't able to push the rents like I thought I would. I wasn't able to push and stabilize the occupancy. I wasn't able to drive much value. So if it were a market that was tighter, like perhaps now, right, where you've really got to know what you're doing, I don't think we would have had the same luck. And so it's a good lesson that like you don't always win, right? It very easily could have gone the other direction. I feel very fortunate that we got out the way that we did.
Yeah, you're very lucky. All right, so looking back on it, there's absolutely nothing you could have done differently. Like this was just a bad property in a bad location.
Yeah, and to say absolutely nothing, I don't want to say that. I'm sure there are things that we could have done, or rocks we could have overturned that we didn't think about. If we were more capitalized at the time, whether to your point, could we have brought our debt service down? But to me, it was just a lesson on be careful in the markets that you're investing in. We invested in Metro Atlanta, right? The only 2 times that we really struggled with our investments are when we went to places that we weren't familiar with. Albany, Georgia, right, where it's a tertiary market, declining population. And then we also went and bought a bunch of duplexes in Indianapolis. Now, Indianapolis is a great spot, great town, great city. Nothing like Albany I'm describing. But again, it was out of our control. It wasn't right in our backyard. And so those 2 were just great lessons. Atlanta was one of the best places, best markets to be in during the 2010s for investing. Why would we try and get cute and get out of what we know?
I hope this episode was helpful to you. I know we hear so many stories of people that are just having incredible success investing in rental properties that it can almost seem like you can't lose. But I think it's important to hear the other side of it and to hear that things can go bad. And as Mike said, you don't always win investing in rental properties. And I think Mike's story illustrates how important it is to really understand the market that you're investing in, to really understand the property, and to make sure that your numbers are realistic. Well, if anybody wants to reach out to Mike, I've got his contact information on the website. You can find it at rentalincomepodcast.com/episode 465. I'd like to thank Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group for sponsoring today's episode. If you're looking to buy a rental property, whether you're just getting started or you want to add to your portfolio, reach out to Chaley. She's a nationwide lender. She has a ton of different loan programs, and she can find something that'll work for you in your situation. If you want to find out more or you want to set up a time to talk to Chaley personally, just go to ridgelendinggroup.com, NMLS 42056. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast today. Make sure you follow the show. I put out a new interview every single Tuesday, and if you're following the show, you'll get notified every Tuesday when the new episode comes out. My name is Dan Lane, and this has been the Rental Income Podcast.